12 May 1945, Munich. In the half-light of a basement room, Karl M. 31 wrote one dangerous sentence in a schoolboy's lined notebook. Our peace will be built with silence, the way our cities were rebuilt with scavenged bricks. He hid the page. He folded it into a book of ration tables. He understood the arithmetic of survival. Paper could be burned. Words could not be taken back. The Americans had entered the city on April 30. Tanks rolled past the Theatina Kirche. Civilians watched from cellars. The Third Reich had ended 8 days later. The city was already a landscape of red dust and broken teeth. The rubble had a weight. It had a mathematics. More than 90% of the old city was damaged or destroyed. A 1945 occupation report described an estimated 30 million cubic meters of debris to be cleared in Munich alone. The figure was an approximation. It felt larger when you were one of the hands moving it. The women arrived with picks and kerchiefs. They came with silent anger. They were counted without names. Trümmerfrauen, Hummer, rubble women. They chipped mortar from bricks and stacked them in clean columns that rose like narrow tombs. A city government bulletin from September 1945 recorded the daily output of brick salvage in a tidy table. Target 100,000, actual 76,000, labor, assigned 1,300 women, 280 men. The figures had a bureaucracy's calm. The work did not. Karl watched them at the corner of Schwanthaler Straße. He returned a glance, then looked away. It was a language of small acknowledgements. Men were missing. A neighbor had a husband who had not come home from Russia. He had not come home from anywhere. Another neighbor whispered of a son last seen in February on the Hungarian plains. There were photographs the color of old newspapers on mantels, intruding on the nightly ration calculations like extra mouths who still belonged in the arithmetic. It was not yet a year of remembering. It was a year of lists. There were lists of the dead. There were lists of the missing. There were lists of what was permitted to eat and when. There were lists of hours when civilians could be on the street without being arrested, and lists of times when the lights had to go out. The curfew in Munich in May 1945 was set at 9 p.m. No exceptions, wrote the U.S. military government, HQ, District of Munich, General Order No. 3. A violation meant detention, a fine, sometimes a beating. It depended on the patrol and the hour. Karl wrote with the door closed. He used a stub of a pencil he had saved through 2 evacuations. He wrote because the sentences steadied him more than the little tablets a city doctor had slipped into his palm the previous week. For your nerves, the doctor had said. It had the bluntness of bread. He didn't ask for a name. The doctor had a name. He had a file. He had a past like everyone else. He was called Dr. Ernst Bruckner. He had classical shoulders and tired eyes. He had been appointed acting head of a neurological ward in 1943 when his superior was transferred to a military hospital. He had served as a consultant to a fitness board earlier in the war. His signature appeared on a stack of 1941 forms that declared men fit for service, and on another that declared an epileptic boy unfit to reproduce under the law that had once looked like science. His name appeared in denazification files in 1946. It appeared in the minutes of a Spruchkammer hearing. He would talk when asked. He would keep still when silence helped. He was the one who wrote, in a case note dated 18 May 1945, Patient K.M., aged 31, civilian. Symptoms: startle reactions to loud noise, sleep disturbance with recurrent images of low-flying aircraft, palpitations, episodes of immobility in crowds, guilt themes in waking hours. He called it war nerves. It had older names from the last war. It did not yet have the one that would come later and settle like a thin layer of dust on the whole century: post-traumatic stress. This was a time when wounds had the names of machines, places, blasts, not the names of fear. The city was hungry. It was a hunger that could be measured and verified. Allied intelligence summaries from June 1945 carried calorie counts that read like dispatches from a battlefield where the enemy was subtraction. The official ration was 1,200 calories a day in the summer of 1945, dipping to as low as 800 for many during the winter of 1945 to 47, depending on zone, job, and whether your body was considered useful to the reconstruction. A brick carrier might be allocated more than a librarian. It was a mathematics of public virtue. It rewarded visible hard work. Potatoes had authority. Bread had the weight of a contract. Fats were like rumors, valuable because they were rare and moved quickly in small packets. Children counted the slices of sausage as if counting days. Grandmothers hoarded sugar like information. Cigarettes were money. The black market created a new arithmetic of exchange that would be remembered in kitchen stories for decades. An American lucky strike was a unit of currency as stable as any Scandinavian krona. 1 lucky for a loaf, 10 for a coat, 90 for a wristwatch that had not been looted. At the Winkel in Munich's Viktualienmarkt, under tarpaulin stands and in shadowed courtyards, most transactions in 1946 started with the same sentence whispered by people who wore their coats at all times. Haben Sie Zigaretten? Occupation reports called it barter. But people didn't barter myths. They bartered calories, warmth, and shame. Carl worked 2 mornings a week at the rubble site. The city counted hours and knocked off from fines. He worked the other days at the municipal housing office. He had been a clerk before the war. He tried to be one again after. He filled out forms that did abstract violence. He signed papers that made strangers share a bedroom. It was called Wohnraumbewirtschaftung. It had the bureaucratic beauty of a compound noun and the cruelty of arithmetic. A family of 5 in a 2-room flat. Add another 3. A widow in a 3-room flat? Remove 2. The city needed walls to hold bodies. It had few walls left. An archival note in the Städtisches Wohnungsamt Records, 1946, file C38, shows his signature on a form that ordered a local family to take in 2 expellees from Silesia. Immediate occupancy required, the stamp read. The expellees were recorded as L, mother 38, daughter 12, grandfather 62. They arrived at the door with a label on their trunk that read Bunzlau in fading script, a place that no one in the house had ever seen, but now had to live with every day. By the summer of 1945, the first trains of Germans pushed from the east began arriving, the people who would be called the Vertriebenen, the expelled. They came from Königsberg, renamed Kaliningrad, from Breslau, renamed Roxwar, from places they called Heimat, but which the locals in Bavaria flinched from, like a bad word or a superstition. The numbers multiplied faster than the runes. The American zone received 1 million within months, the British zone more. The arithmetic of the Western lender changed like a ledger hit by war's last line item. They were hungry in the way you can count, but they were also hungry in the way that cannot be seen by a ration officer. They wanted what you could not allocate with a rubber stamp, a fence of a particular color viewed from a particular bedroom, a cemetery where the names were right, a dialect in the street that sounded like home. Those were losses that made their own noise when the windows rattled at night. The locals did not want them. They didn't have room. They said so in sentences shaped like pity and resignation, and in others shaped like complaint. Oral history interviews recorded in the 1970s in Bavarian villages show the same phrases recurring. We had nothing ourselves. They came with nothing. They were different. Loud. They were different. Loud. They took our husbands' jobs. We had to give them 1 bed. They took our husbands' jobs. We had to give them 1 bed. The expellees brought their own politics. They organized quickly. They printed a newspaper with a title that sounded like geography, Die Stimme der Heimat. They gathered in the beer halls and made speeches about injustices that were true and that could not be undone. They became a constituency whose votes would be counted in Bonn a few years later. At the edge of the city, the displaced gathered in camps. They wore odd suits and wrapped packages with a string that had crossed too many borders. There were Poles who had been made to labor, French who had been captured, Russian women who never spoke unless spoken to in the exact way. There were Jews who had returned from the camps, not to their towns where their neighbors lived, but to barracks where strangers lived. They were counted by officials and written about in occupation reports as DPs, displaced persons, as if the worst thing that had happened to them had involved maps. At Feldafing, 8 kilometers southwest of Munich, a DP camp for Jewish survivors was established on the grounds of a former Hitler Youth School. It had an irony people tried not to think about. U.S. Army reports from October 1945 recorded discontent there, insufficient food, lack of clothing, insufficient privacy, deep suspicion of German population. The phrase that Germans in the city heard or read was a Jewish camp. They sometimes said it with pity. They sometimes said it with something else. There was a policy at first that sought to confront Germans with what had been done in their name. It had a cold logic. It took the form of visits. German civilians were made to walk through the camps. They were made to look at the rooms where people had been held and died. They were shown corpses in photographs, long lines of bodies that had no weight anymore, and no smell by the time they were printed. A U.S. Army report, Psychological Warfare Division, May 1945, about Dachau, detailed compulsory tours for residents of Munich. The intention was to force a moral reckoning that the hunger and the rubble had not already forced. Some looked, some didn't. Some looked and turned away. Some looked and then said other things like, "We suffered too," because it was the only grammar that seemed to make survival a subject. Karl went once. He saw a photograph he could not carry. He thought of his father's face in a frame and looked away. He experienced the mathematics of guilt as subtraction without an answer. What could he subtract from himself that would produce justice? His own past was careful. He had joined nothing that required parades. He had paid dues to the National Socialist People's Welfare because you had to. He had signed receipts. He had watched. He had kept his head down and learned to write clean numbers in a dirty time. He could say those sentences later when asked. After May, the questions began. They came on thin paper with fine print. The denazification questionnaire, the Fragebogen, was a test of memory and a test of imagination. It was administered in the U.S. Zone beginning in January 1946, 31 questions, 4 to 8 pages depending on the printing, with boxes for membership in organizations that had been declared criminal and for positions held. Were you a member of the NSDAP? If yes, state the year of joining and membership number. Were you a member of the SA, the SS, NSV, NSV? It was a catalogue of acronyms that felt like a filing cabinet collapsing in a room. K, the Spruchkammer, the denazification court, assigned a reviewer. They summoned him to a hearing in May. The record shows 3 sentences in his file. Applicant is a minor employee with no leadership positions. No evidence of active National Socialist agitation. Category 4, Mitläufer, follower. It was a category that was supposed to be moral but was instead mathematical. It processed mathematical. It processed millions into a few bins and then sent them back to work. But many files were not so clean. The mathematics of guilt could not satisfy the political arithmetic of rebuilding a country into the form the occupiers needed. The categories were 5. Category 1, Hauptschuldig, major offenders. Category 2, Belastet offenders. Category 3, Minderbelastet, lesser offenders. Category 3, Mitläufer followers. Category 4, Mitläufer followers. Category V, Entlastet, exonerated. The intent was simple. The practice was complex. The system needed stability more than it needed thorough justice. It required teachers. It required police. It required railway managers. It required doctors. In 1947, an Allied intelligence report judged the denazification apparatus in Bavaria as increasingly lenient, noting the use of Persilschiene, the whitewashing affidavits written by neighbors and priests and former colleagues to vouch for defendants. The reports used the word whitening. It was apt. It also evoked the smell of laundry boiled in soda, hanging behind apartments where people kept looking straight ahead in lines to get coal. Dr. Bruckner had a Persilschiene. The nun who ran a Catholic charity hospital signed it. She had seen him obtain medicines for patients who had been marked, unofficially, with the wrong background. He had bent rules for a few. He had followed rules for many. He had signed forms with boys' names, and he carried those signatures into his sleep. The Spruchkammer placed him in Category 3 and fined him. He was suspended from public practice for 6 months. Then the ward needed a doctor. He returned to work in early 1946. The arithmetic of scarcity spared him. He took a sheet of paper and managed a different sort of ration. His notes had the economy of a field report: symptomatology, palpitations, nightmares, startle, treatment, autogenic training, small doses of bromides, 1 ampule morphine sulfate provided, to be used sparingly due to limited stock, supportive talk, assign patient to light work. He used methods that were simple and old. He taught breathing and weight. He asked men to imagine their limbs heavy. He counted backwards with them and mapped calm onto a body that had learned how to run even while sitting still. He told women who came with trembling hands and a far gaze to train their palms to be warm. He borrowed a technique developed before the war by Johannes Heinrich Schultz, autogenic training. He disliked the fact that Schultz had written other things in the 1930s that made the method taste faintly of metal. He used it anyway because it quieted people. A letter from a patient in 1947, preserved in the hospital's administrative file, said, "The exercises in breathing and imagining ease helped me to ride the tram without panic. I still cannot stand the sirens." Another patient wrote, in a letter that might as well be a field report, "When I feel the pounding, I lie down and say to myself, arm heavy, leg heavy, breath calm. Sometimes it works. When I see a bomber in a newsreel, nothing works." He called it nervous exhaustion and war shock and neurasthenia. He scrawled diagnoses that were vaguely Latin and precise only in their repetition. He treated men who had been on the Eastern Front and women who had lived through nights when the cellar hummed with noise and groans. He treated a former police investigator who had been made to do things to himself in a British prison and could not stop shaking. He treated a woman expelled from Glogau who shook as if she were in a draft when someone said in the tram that expellés should go back where they came from. He believed that if you helped people sleep and gave them work, you gave them 2 legs to stand on. He didn't ask some questions that a later generation would insist on asking. He was a man of his time. He believed that talking could help in the way that a blanket helps under a broken roof. It keeps you alive. It doesn't fix the house. The winter of 1946-47 was a freeze that would be remembered like a battle. The year was named like a campaign, the Hunger Winter. It was a different war, fought with thin coats and bright cheeks and the cracking of basins frozen to the wall in the morning. People stole coal from the railway yard. The word Fringsen was born after the Archbishop of Cologne told the faithful on New Year's Eve that taking coal to heat their homes was not a sin. People stole without confessing. It wasn't theft for thieves, It was survival for the newly righteous. A U.S. Army report, Office of Military Government for Bavaria, January 1947, recorded average daily available calories for non-laborers in Munich, estimated 1,000. The report's author wrote in a hand like a mathematician's, significant risk of widespread malnutrition. The sentences were thin like the people in the queue. People did not die in the streets. They died in rooms where what was missing was the fat on their bodies and the future in their heads. The nutrition mathematics disguised another arithmetic, guilt and talk. When your chest counts breaths, you have no extra room for counting culpabilities. Public forums on the past dwindled. The denazification courts pushed papers and then stacked them. People burned pasts in stoves. People wrote sentences like Karl's and hid them. Then, in 1948, new money and new assumptions entered. The currency reform of 20 June 1948 was a clean slash. It took everyone's accounts and made them smaller. It put new Deutschemarks in the hands of people who counted by days and wits. It ended certain arithmetics and started others. The black market collapsed in a week. The cigarettes suddenly became entertainment again instead of banknotes. Shop windows filled with goods that had been hiding. A British Control Commission memorandum called it pent-up supply. It looked like a carnival of cans of coffee and socks that didn't have holes. Karl had a job he could keep. He still worked in the housing office. He did not like what it made him do, but he preferred thinking about walls to thinking about graves. He carried the office's new ledgers in a bag made from parachute silk that a cousin had saved. He ate lunch standing because chairs made him think of broken chairs. He still woke at the sound of low aircraft, even when there were none. He had a doctor now and called it what the doctor called it, a nervous condition. A year later, he would call it pressure. 20 years later, he would call it old age. The Berlin airlift began in June 1948. It did not change his calorie allocation. It changed his sentences. Suddenly, the city spoke about East and West, as if they were algebraic expressions. The mathematics of the Cold War required variables that could be manipulated on maps. It required denazification to go quiet. It required the word totalitarian to make two regimes look like cousins. The Americans and British and French developed the structures that would become a state. The Russians built a state in their zone on other terms. Germans learned to live between. They learned to answer questions about the present that used words like freedom, instead of questions about the past that used names. In May 1949, the Federal Republic of Germany was proclaimed in Bonn. In October, the German Democratic Republic was proclaimed in East Berlin. The arithmetic changed again. Denazification gave way to amnesty. The economic calculus replaced the moral calculus in daily talk. The phrase Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle, began to move in the mouths of men like a small prayer. The denominator was different, but the function was the same. Reduce everything to quantities that could be counted, celebrate addition, postpone subtraction. In the summer of 1950, Karl kept a notebook of job numbers. The ledger showed a new curve, orders up, employment up, wages rising like bread. A Marshall Plan shipment of machine tools arrived at a factory near the Hauptbahnhof. Boxes with US Hauptbahnhof. Markings were unloaded with a civility that war had not taught anyone, but that people learned because it led to work. The occupation reports, now calmly titled Economic Surveys, reported rising industrial output indices, 120 compared to 100 in 1936. The numbers were not yet poetry, but they were a rhythm. People understood. Karl had a quiet sense that this new democracy was built on bargains that were not spoken. It could be seen in his office when an old colleague returned. Hair V blonde, smooth, a good signature returned in 1951 to a desk he had occupied as a party member in the 1930s. He sat with his back straight and his sentences shorter than before. He had a file that had been closed with a stamp. He had been declared a follower, fined, and then reinstated under Section 31 of the Civil Service Law, the law that restored former civil servants from the German Reich to positions in the Federal Republic. A Bundesarchiv file on civil service reinstatements lists 131,000 men in the 1950s who returned, with their pensions. The number is an accident of numbering and fate. People made jokes about the 131ers that were not really jokes. The city needed their forms more than it needed their apologies. Bruckner watched all of it from a clinic where the windows no longer had paper. He treated men whose hands trembled when their sons practiced multiplication tables at the kitchen table and wrote down wrong numbers. He treated women who could not sleep in rooms where their husbands' legs touched theirs because at night a touch was a sound. He treated a man named Otto E., 42, who had been a police investigator under the Nazi regime, who was now a furniture salesman and did not recognize himself in the mirror because he could not answer the questions his own children asked. The doctor wrote, "Wife reports nightly screaming. Patient has palpitations. He says his heart is a traitor." He had no political lecture to give them. He had no political lecture to give them. He had no absolution to hand out with the small tablets of barbiturates. He had routines he counted on, and he used them like an engineer uses a measuring stick. The mathematics of healing was crude. It worked sometimes. If the patient could go to work and hold a job and not beat his children, the doctor called it improvement. He taught his patients to count their breaths. He wrote instructions. Lie down 15 minutes daily. Repeat phrases, arm heavy, breathing calm, heart beats regular. He made his voice flat and constant. He did not ask them to confess. He was not a priest. He did not ask them what they would do if called to testify. He was not a prosecutor. He did not ask them to remember that which would flood them. He was not an historian. Others were. In 1946, a philosopher in Basel named Karl Jaspers delivered lectures that were printed in German the next year as Die Schuldfrage, the question of German guilt. The pamphlet circulated in Karl's city in mimeographed form, then in cloth. Someone gave a dog-eared copy to Bruckner. He underlined a sentence, "Wir müssen uns der Wahrheit stellen, we must face the truth." He underlined another, "Es gibt eine politische Schuld." He nodded as if he had just written a prescription. He put the pamphlet in a drawer and prescribed autogenic training to a man who could not endure truth after midnight. The papers sat there next to a bottle of phenobarbital and a book of Goethe poems that nurses read to soldiers in the last war. He lived in a country where philosophers and clerks did their work adjacent to one another, like neighbors in a stairwell. Around them, the schools opened. The new republic needed a curriculum. It chose a narrative that concentrated on the dictatorship as a deviation and the nation as its victim. Schoolbooks in the early 1950s in Bavaria gave the chronology in a neat table: Versailles, inflation, Hitler's rise, war, defeat. The sentences were clean, the photographs bland. There was sometimes a photograph bland. There was sometimes a photograph of a destroyed street corner. There was rarely a photograph of a cattle car. The bombing was a system failure that could be talked about. The extermination was a taboo that was rewritten as a loss of rule of law. Public commemorations were for the clean grief, the grief that felt like an acknowledgement and not an indictment. The dead of the Bombenkrieg were remembered with solemnity. Cemeteries received stone crosses and words like Opfer, victim, carved into them. The expellees had a day in many towns, Tag der Heimat. They marched with banners of lost cities and wore their dialects like badges. The city's new monument, built in 1955, could contain all losses except those that carried the taint of intentional crime. Adenauer said, "Keine Experimente." The slogan worked for the body and the soul. Don't touch the wounds. Don't go looking for guilt in every old photograph. Build houses. Build roads. Build refrigerators. Buy a radio and listen to the new songs. Buy a scooter. Send your children to a school where they will read history that you do not have to translate into nightmares. The doctor was now the former party member and the citizen of a new democracy. He wore his suit on Sundays. He did not go to church. He visited his sister in a small town where everyone knew him from before, and he knew everyone. They drank beer in a garden under leaves that had no memory. He said nothing to them about the paper in his drawer. They said nothing to him about the boy. He listened when they talked about the price of butter. He nodded when they spoke of the Russians in a way that made the present sound like justice. The American reports turned into economic assessments and then cultural bulletins. They measured the number of radios per household, the number of refrigerators per 100 people. A 1953 report for the U.S. High Commission recorded the rising ownership of washing machines in the American zone like a health statistic. These were the numbers of the new life. But the old arithmetic always turned up in the drawer or in the clinic when a patient put his face in his hands and said, "I can't." It was a sentence that could mean anything. It meant the same thing: I can't bear remembering without relief. In 1952, Parliament in Bonn passed the Lastenausgleichsgesetz, the law of burden sharing, to compensate those who had lost property in the flight and expulsions. It provided long-term loans, small payments, land allocations. The mathematics of state benevolence entered every family's ledger. It removed certain kinds of resentment and hardened others. Neighbors said, "They get money for what we all lost." The expellees said, "They pay us because they never wanted us." Both were true and untrue. The arithmetic functioned as many of the new republic's successful policies did. It made living possible while leaving thinking for later. That same year, the Parliament passed a law for compensation to victims of National Socialist persecution, the Bundesentschädigungsgesetz. Some citizens who had been forced to flee or hide or survive camps received small checks and letters with the phrase "Im Namen des Volkes." Others received nothing because they were Jews from Poland or Hungary, or because paperwork was incomplete, or because witnesses were gone, or because the bureaucracy found the wrong box. The mathematics of justice had the same old flaw. It was made by people. The doctor kept treating. The clinic's records for 1954 show a slight change in the words he used. He wrote traumatic neurosis more often. He wrote after effects of war experience. He wrote severe depressive episodes, a category that had existed as long as people had counted sleep, but that now had a medical weight new to this place and time. He wrote, Mrs. R., aged 39, expelled from Cogitine in 1945, complains of recurrent nightmares of soldiers at the door. Prescribed chloral hydrate, thrice weekly sessions of autogenic training. Patient reports slight relief. He became an expert in the same country that had made him a functionary. He presented at a conference in Stuttgart in 1955 on the sequelae of war in civilians, using phrases that have since become sedatives: coping, stress, restore function. He used no one's names. He used a caution that looked like science and felt like self-protection. He had no new miracle to offer. He offered his time and the seriousness of a man who had signed lonely papers a decade earlier, and now tried to throw time itself at the problem of those papers. In Carl's office, new posters were tacked to walls. Focus on safety, they said. Work precisely. Don't talk. Another poster was a news clipping of Ludwig Erhard smiling while holding a packet of butter. He had become a saint in the new pantheon. Karl found it easier to admire saints whose hands were clean because they held consumer goods. He found it harder to think about artists and poets and thinkers in a country where art had been used as a spear. He married in 1951. He moved into a two-room flat allocated by his own office. It was a conflict of interest. He took comfort in the fact that the window faced a courtyard where children played, not the wall of another flat where a woman cried at night. He and his wife had a son in 1953. The boy slept in a cot made out of two crates nailed together and painted a cheerful blue. It was a practical object. It was a compromise. It was how people lived in the 1950s in a city that wanted to forget the 1940s. He burned the piece of paper with his line in 1952. He could recite it anyway. He could say it in his head and not out loud. Our peace will be built with silence. The mathematics of selective memory began to take over his visits to friends. They would remember the best teacher in the Nazi years. They would remember the day in 1936 when the Olympic torch ran past the gymnasium and how beautiful it was. They would remember music and uniforms and say, "Not everything was bad," with a tone that begged you to stop arguing. They would not remember the expulsion of a classmate. They would not remember the dentist who disappeared and whose house later always seemed to be the house where someone else's flats were nicer. He did not argue. He did not stop them. He did not talk politics. He stopped reading the newspaper's second section where the trials were reported. He did not read that, in 1958, the Central Office for the Investigation of National Socialist Crimes was established in Ludwigsburg. He did not think about the neighbor who had been a guard. He did not ask. He did not tell. He had a son who was learning to climb stairs. He held the boy's waist and said, "Slowly," and the boy laughed, and the staircase was just a staircase then. Bruckner read the paper. He read the parts that others skipped. He read about the Ulm-Einsatzgruppen trial in 1958. He underlined names and dates with a pencil. He did not tell his patients. He knew that the city had only so many hours each day when it could keep water boiling and keep refrigerators on. He suspected that the city had only so many hours each day when it could bear to keep the truth's burner on. He rationed topics like sugar. He would give out an ounce of discussion of guilt if he thought it wouldn't make a patient spit the pill of sleep out of his mouth. The country looked outwards. It looked towards the West. It applied for membership in the European coal and steel community. It wore ties and called public servants by new names that made them sound less like the police. The geography of Germany changed. Borders settled with the pressure of new facts. People learned to say they were European to avoid the question of what else they were. Schools taught geography and arithmetic. They taught history with dates that could be remembered without crying. Teachers born in 1910 taught lessons about wars they had lived through, using words that they could pronounce without choking. A 1956 schoolbook by a publisher in Würzburg presented National Socialism in 6 pages, half pictures, without the word Jew. It